Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brooks Lyles, the Historian General of the National Society Sons of the American Revolution, and we are doing our 13th in the Speaking Out About History series. Today, we're very excited to have Benjamin Carp with us. So, Benjamin L. Carp is the author of The Great Fire of New York, 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution, and The Defiance of the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, which won the Triennial Society of the Cincinnati Cox Book Prize in 2013. He's also written Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution in 2007, and with Richard D. Brown, he co-edited Major Problems in the Era of the American Revolution, 1760 to 1791, a series of documents and essays, which is in its third edition. He has written about nationalism, firefighters, Benjamin Franklin, Quaker merchants in Charleston. He's also written for Colonial Williamsburg, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He previously taught at the University of Edinburgh and Tufts University. He was born and raised in New York State, and each of his parents earned 2 City University of New York degrees, while Ben himself has earned a BA from Yale in 1998 in history, a Master's of Arts in history from the University of Virginia in 1999, and in 2004, got his doctorate in history from the University of Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present Benjamin Carp, Professor, and Daniel M. Lyons, Chair of History at Brooklyn College, University of New York. Ben.
Hi, thank you so much for that kind introduction.
You could give us a little overview of the 2 books we're going to be talking about today, which is The Defiance of the Patriots and The Great Fire of New York.
I wrote this book on the Boston Tea Party. It came out back in 2010, and it grew out of my first book, which talked about political mobilization in the large cities of North America in the years leading up to the American Revolution. And so the first chapter of that book, Rebels Rising, is on the Boston waterfront. And on the basis of the work that I had done on politics on the Boston waterfront, naturally, when an editor came to me saying, "When was the last time someone wrote a book on the Boston Tea Party?" I said, "Well, boy, there is some new stuff we can say about that." And so I wrote this book on the Boston Tea Party that came out a number of years ago. But of course, it's been fresh now, and everybody wants to talk about it again because we have the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party on December 16th of this year. So that's really coming up in just 6 weeks. But the book on the New York City fire, the Great New York Fire of 1776, that actually grew out of an earlier project in some ways. It grew out of undergraduate research that I had done. I'd been interested in fire and firefighting in the 18th century when I was an undergraduate, and I first came across one of the major sources that composes this book all the way back, I think, in 1997. So, and I'd written an article on the fire in 2006, but now I thought, oh, it's time for me to do a full-length treatment of this book. I was interested in the destruction of towns, cities, and Indian settlements during the Revolutionary War. I have a couple of chapters in this book that touch on that, but I really wanted there to be a local focus on this event because it's always been such an interesting puzzle for me. And I really wanted to try and piece that puzzle together for readers as best as I could.
Well, thank you. This is the book, The Defiance of the Patriots, the first one we're going to talk about. And here within the SAR, we refer to the upcoming period as the decade of the Revolution. And our first signature event is going to be the Boston Tea Party. So a lot of us will be up in Boston for the celebration and the reenactment.
I'll be in town, so say hi if you see me.
Yeah, well, we're having a parade from Faneuil Hall down to the wharf, and we've been collecting tea from around the country and sending it to the Tea Party Museum to be part of the ceremony, ceremoniously dumped. So the way this process works is we go out, we advertise to our membership, the upcoming author and books, and our compatriots submit questions. So we're going to go through a series of questions here. We're going to start with the Defiance of the Patriots. And our first question is from Bobby Hulse of the Kansas Society. Bobby says, if it were not for Samuel Adams, who may have stepped up to lead the movement that was the Sons of Liberty? And would the Boston Tea Party have ever happened?
Yeah, it's funny. This question grows out of the kind of old school great man theory of history, right? That it's singular people who drive history. But everything that I've read about the Boston Sons of Liberty suggests to me that it wasn't like that at all. That's not to diminish Samuel Adams's unique talents and his ability to forge connection among a wide group of Bostonians. But as academic as it sounds, I really think a lot of the efforts of the Boston Sons of Liberty were the work of committees. Of many men working together: John Hancock, Joseph Warren, Thomas Young, Benjamin Church before he turned traitor, William Molyneux, and then further down in the social status hierarchy, people like Paul Revere, right? And even further down from that, you need to think about guys like Ebenezer McIntosh and George Robert Twelves Hughes. I mean, the way that I always like to think about Boston is you had your elite members of society who worked within the legislature, who petitioned Parliament. But then you had your more middle class members of Boston who joined voluntary associations and might have been part of the North End Caucus and maybe even the Boston Committee of Correspondence. And then you had your working class Bostonians who operated in the streets, street theater, parades, and sometimes even violence. And so these groups in Boston wound up working together very well most of the time in order to protest the acts of Parliament. But the interesting thing about Samuel Adams is that he's not like the wizard behind the curtain, the puppeteer directing everything. He's been kind of mischaracterized that way by a lot of historians for many, many years. Instead, he was somebody who was good at persuading other Bostonians, like, yes, our interests are all aligned here, right? We might have different views about the best tactics, but we really ought to try and get along as best as we can because Britain represents the bigger threat. So I think really this isn't to diminish Samuel Adams, but it is to say that there were a number of other men who could have assumed that kind of leadership role. It's true that some of them had health problems. Quincy, for instance, John Adams did himself for a little while, but and John Hancock, has a kind of moderate phase in the early 1770s. But I really wonder if somebody like Joseph Warren. And the only reason we didn't find out more about what Warren could do is, of course, that he died at the Battle of Bunker Hill, only a couple of months after the war began.
Yeah, I think what you get from the book is that the momentum had been building for some time, and it was almost a preordained that there was going to be an incident.
Yes and no. I mean, when in 1773, things had really been quite quiet in Boston since the Boston Massacre, right? People often refer to it as a period of calm or the quiet years when there's still tension. But actually, a lot of things about the resistance movement kind of slowed down during those years, in part because there was some fear that there might be a foreign war with France or Spain. So there was a bit more unity, but there really isn't any new provocation in Boston until Hutchinson's letters are publicized earlier in the year in 1773. So I don't think that there was necessarily an inevitability, but that the passage of the Tea Act really does provoke a lot of things that had been kind of lying dormant in Boston and in some of the other colonies as well.
All right, thank you. Second question is for Larry Josephowski of the Delaware Society. Larry says, the Boston Tea Party seems to be like one of many political expediencies of the day. How much of it was a result of merchants thinking their smuggled tea would be worthless? And how many of those involved were actually merchants? And if not that many, how did they convince others to join in what had to be seen as a fairly dangerous operation?
Yeah, this is a great question. The question, and I'll be in Delaware shortly talking about the new book. But it's a great question because it's the more materialist argument about the revolution, that the revolutionaries were motivated primarily by their economic interests rather than the kind of high-minded ideals of government by consent, et cetera, et cetera. And so legitimate merchants and smugglers both had something to fear from the Tea Act and also from some of the other parliamentary legislation as well, going all the way back to the Navigation Acts. I mean, Bostonians really wanted to be able to trade with the enemy, with French sugar islands. And what the Tea Act represents is two things. One, it represents the continuation of taxation without representation, but it also represented propping up a monopoly company, the British East India Company, and giving them special privileges, basically to undersell local merchants, right? It was giving them the power to undersell local merchants. And when the Bostonians and other northern merchants look at these things, they see two slippery slope problems. One is, if the Americans consent to a tax on tea, then what's to prevent Parliament from just taxing every import into the American colonies, right? And kind of bleeding the Americans dry through that means. But then the monopoly represents another potential slippery slope. If the British can establish a monopoly on tea in America, and I mean, they already had a monopoly on tea imports to Britain, but if they also had a monopoly on tea exports from Britain to the colonies, what's then to prevent them from putting monopolies on other British manufactured goods, right? Or other commodities that couldn't be grown in North America. And so again, that would be very dangerous to Americans' pockets. So yes, the merchants do have to do some work to convince everybody else, like, this is not just going to hurt us as traders, but you as consumers as well. And so that's one of the reasons why the non-importation agreement that had lasted since the passage of the Townshend Acts in around 1768, which the Bostonians had violated a little bit, actually, and the New Yorkers and Philadelphians were a little suspicious of the Bostonians. But that's why the Non-Importation Act was so important. And there was this idea that, especially after the Boston Tea Party, that Bostonians shouldn't be drinking tea. Now, it's a little tricky because you could say, oh, but I'm drinking smuggled tea from a Dutch company. But it's like, how can anyone know? It's the same tea from China, et cetera, et cetera. So, so what the American colonists who are trying to resist the Acts of Parliament really try to do is build a movement, a widespread consumer boycott movement, in addition to the merchants' non-importation agreements, in order to say, we're in this together, both trader and consumer. We have to stand strong and not drink this taxed tea in order to make the point to Parliament that they shouldn't be able to tax us at all. So again, that does take some work, but and a lot of loyalists and the British government are really suspicious that, yeah, this is just cooked up by a bunch of greedy, selfish merchants, et cetera, et cetera. But again, I think people like Samuel Adams, who's not a successful merchant himself, right? They do a lot of work to persuade Americans that the threat is real and that it's widespread and not just something that applies to merchants.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting, where through the committees of correspondence and local newspapers, where both Philadelphia and New York were chastising Boston for not being fully on board with the non-importation, and following the Tea Party, where they were giving them huzzas for actually standing up and doing what they had been saying they were doing.
Yeah.
So the tea and the East India Tea Company, or the East India Company, had built a sort of a global economy on tea. And there was a glut. The warehouses in England were full. They were, as you lay out quite well, establishing a monopoly and selling to their own designated agents. They were going to distribute the tea. So there's some background, and it's laid out very well in the book. Our next question from Shane James of the International Society asks, what did the North American colonies have in common with the East India Tea Company?
Sure, I talk about this in the book, that you can think of them almost as cousins, right? They were both, the Massachusetts Bay Company and the East India Company were both established during the Elizabethan era, when England was quite weak. And they say, okay, if you want to go and perform some sort of risky overseer's adventure, that's fine. The crown will kind of give you its blessing, but we're not going to necessarily provide you with naval resources that would be far too expensive on the taxpayers. Instead, it's, well, this venture might not be successful, but if it is successful, then we will grant you a certain kind of monopoly over territory or something. So the East India Company got a monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. And what the Massachusetts Bay Company, which later became a colony, became is, okay, you will have the right to the Massachusetts Bay, and you'll be able to call yourself a colony and you'll get your own charter. So both the East India Company and Massachusetts were chartered companies originally, who really tried to defend their chartered rights. And so when the tea crisis happens, there's like a brief moment when the people of Massachusetts are kind of like, hey, maybe we have something in common. But when the Tea Act is passed, they quickly realized, oh, the East India Company has a much better lobby than us. A lot of the members of Parliament are invested in the East India Company. And when push comes to shove, Parliament is going to favor the interests of the East India Company over that of New England or the American colonies. So while there were certain things that the two areas had in common in relation to Parliament and to the British Empire, in the end, it's the perception of the Americans that they are they're the unwanted stepchildren or something within the empire compared to the East India Company that really starts to make them nervous and angry. And they even start to point to the East India Company's behavior in India. Look, you starved all these Bengalis, you're rife with corruption, et cetera, et cetera. If the Americans are going to do better than the Bengalis, then they need to stand up for their rights now, or they'll be drained dry, just as the East India Company has drained South Asia dry, or has begun to drain South Asia dry. So we don't want to call this a kind of humanitarian impulse, but there's at least a hint of a little bit of solidarity there, at the idea that the British Empire can be oppressive in all sorts of ways abroad, and that's something the American colonists ought to do something about before it's too late.
All right. Well, thank you. Next question from Gary Green of North Carolina says, after the Boston Tea Party, why has the racism of the Bostonian leaders never been questioned? Why did the core group pick an Indian disguise versus just covering their faces?
I mean, if we want to talk about racial prejudice, people talk about the revolutionary generation's ethnic prejudice all the time, right? I mean, they spend the Revolutionary War dispossessing Native people of their homelands. They continue to practice slavery in the bulk of the colonies, and only gradually emancipate enslaved people in the North, right, et cetera. And there is actually a great book that helped inspire. I wrote a whole chapter on Indian disguises, but one of the great books that inspired that chapter was by a now Harvard professor named Phil Deloria. He wrote a book called Playing Indian that looks at the long history of white people taking on Indian disguises. And he really starts the book with the Boston Tea Party and then kind of takes it into the late 20th century. So kind of talking about how there's a long history of this stuff. And he had some really insightful things to say about how the Indian disguises really kind of represented a colonial American identity that was both not British, but also not native in this really interesting way. I mean, I could go on for a long time. You'll have to tell me whether you have a follow-up question about the disguises, because there's a lot that I can say about the disguises and what I think the meanings of them were. But I think most people who think about it now agree that, like, oh, that kind of cosplaying is not something that we would countenance today, that it misrepresents actual Native people. It's offensive in all sorts of ways. No one would have called it racist at the time, really, but certainly with our current values, most of us would kind of condemn that sort of behavior as, in the same way we've got Halloween coming up, at least at the time of this recording, right? In the same way, children and adults are enjoined not to dress as ethnic groups that aren't their own.
Well, I will hit the follow-up for you there. Why did they choose Mohawks rather than Stockbridge or any of the other local tribes?
Yeah, there is some evidence actually that they're called Narragansetts, or that the ones who emptied the tea from the ship that ran ashore on Cape Cod, referring to them as Mashpee. So there was some indication of choosing other native nation designators for people who protested tea. The reason why Mohawk was originally used, I think, and the reason why it stuck is that there was a New York newspaper that originally, used the word Mohawk in connection with a tea protest, and this was in advance of the Boston Tea Party. So it's possible that they heard that. But also, I mean, the people of New England had a long history of the Mohawks, going back to King Philip's War, and perhaps even earlier than that. It was the closest of the Haudenosaunee nations. There had been alliances and antagonisms. A lot of New Englanders were thinking about moving into upstate New York. And so the Mohawks had a reputation of being kind of fearsome and independent and trying to resist British encroachment. And so I think that the white Americans kind of look at that and say, oh, maybe that's an example that we ought to follow if we want to send a message and don a fearsome costume in order to make the British think twice about sending more tea, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we don't have any evidence of the men themselves saying this is why we chose this disguise, but there's a lot of reasonable speculation that we can do about why they chose this particular disguise. I mean, one thing I always emphasize is that they're not actually trying to conceal their identity. I mean, there were only 16,000 people in Boston, and fewer than a quarter of that would have been adult men. So everybody kind of knew who these guys were, right? Like, you knew how your neighbor walked or your cousin carried himself. The disguises were really more meant to send a message like, okay, don't testify about the fact that you know who the people are underneath these disguises. Instead, the disguises are meant to send a message like, we are pretending to be anonymous here. And it was also meant to suggest these are not actual Bostonians. These are outsiders. And again, even though this is fictive, right, they're supposed to be outsiders. Therefore, Boston should not be punished for this act. Of course, that's what Parliament does anyway. They pass the Boston Port Act and punish Boston for the destruction of the tea.
So an attempt at establishing plausible deniability.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Our next question is from Jim Holmes, who's the president of the Massachusetts Society. So Jim says, with the highly secretive nature of the Boston Tea Party activities, can you elaborate on the activities of some of the key players in the event, like Joseph Warren, Paul Revere, Benjamin Eads, Sam Adams, the Sons of Liberty, and St. Andrew's Lodge?
Sure. I pay attention to all of these things. One of the things that I did was I tried to establish a list at the back of my book of about 100 men who I think have the most credible claims to participating in the Boston Tea Party. And then I decided, okay, I want to know everything I can about these guys. How old were they? What were their occupations? Had they been involved in political activity before? Where were they from? Where did they move later in life, right? I tried to kind of build a profile of what would have motivated them on that night in 1773. And many of them were Masons. Some of them were members of the New England Caucus, or had been listed as among the Sons of Liberty dining at the Liberty Tree in 1769. I noticed that the bullets narrowly missed 5 of these people at the Boston Massacre, and so that may have motivated some of them. So I really got interested in that. As far as somebody like Joseph Warren or Samuel Adams, they ostentatiously stayed behind in the Old South Meeting House as the disguised men and the crowds all went down to Griffin's Wharf. They stayed at the head of the meeting and said, no, listen to more speeches, et cetera, et cetera. So to use the phrase you just used, they definitely had plausible deniability that the leading Bostonians were kind of very prominently staying behind as everybody else went down to the wharves. But there were other people who we now think of as prominent who were said to have been among the men who dumped the tea overboard, like Paul Revere. Really only a handful of guys who could be described as upper class or merchants. Most of them were men who worked with their hands on the waterfront. Some of them were even young teenaged apprentices who were asked to join. But although there was some suggestion afterwards that it was men from out of town who had done the deed, from what I can tell, most of them were local trusted men from Boston. There were so-called captains of each of the ships whose names are not very well known today. But if you look at their profile, they had the right connections and experience, and really were meant to be, would have been recognized as local leaders among this community. I'm blanking on their names right now, but in the book, I really highlight who those 3 men were and why they would have been fitting to kind of direct people on the scene.
Well, and in the book, you focus on the fact that they operated as a very well-oiled machine. They were efficient. They got in. They did not do any damage to the ship or to other property. They went solely for the tea.
Yeah.
They dumped it. They cleaned up after themselves, and they exited. So it was. It would almost seem as if they'd rehearsed it, but there was not any evidence, I guess, to suggest that they had done that. But it was very well run.
Well, that's something I should have said before, is that, you know, most of these guys were from the Boston waterfront community, and we can imagine that a lot of them knew their way around a ship. They knew how to use block and tackle, you know, they had strong backs and could hoist these very heavy chests of tea on deck. And then it was just a matter of taking an axe, chopping it up, and dumping them overboard. But this point, and I know you had a question. You'll have to mention the questioner's name about why didn't they steal the tea as opposed to, you know, destroying it. But that was an important point for them. Like, we are not thieves, right? We're not doing this for petty, greedy reasons. We're doing this as a matter of principle, that if the tea can't be sent back to London, that it must not land. And so therefore, the only honorable thing to do is destroy it entirely, not pocket it for private use, that this was a matter of public good, not private greed. And so, in fact, there's a man named Charles Connor, who really is the only person we know for sure from a contemporary account that was actually on board the ships. Connor decides to start pocketing some tea for himself. And when they catch him, they beat him up, and they strip his coat off, and they kind of nail it to a signpost outside his door in Charlestown, saying, you know, that he had, you know, really threatened the cause in this way, because the Bostonians didn't want to be painted as thieves, right, as violating a commandment, right? Instead, they were destroyers, because that seemed to be more a matter of principle. And
Yes,
again,
and
right,
that
like
was
not damaging anything else, right? Their grievance was against the tea. They're not trying to damage the ships or anything or any other cargo that was on board the ship.
and there was still the national, if there was a national perspective, but the perspective of most of the colonies at that time was that reconciliation was still the objective. They weren't thinking independence at this time.
Sure, plenty of people were deeply invested in the empire, right? They loved the king. You know, many of them were members of the Church of England, including George Washington, right? A lot of them, you know, and the King, George III, was technically the head of the Church of England. They made money from trade with the British Empire, and you know, not all merchants felt good about that, but a lot of people did. And so, yeah, if Parliament could have repealed all of the acts that were offending Americans in 1773, perhaps American independence could have been postponed for many, many more years. Maybe the American colonies could have left the empire under peaceful terms the way that Canada did in the 19th century. But instead, because Britain insisted on you know, the idea that the Americans should obey parliamentary legislation and help generate revenue to pay off the debts from the 7 Years' War and for the continued troop presence around the Great Lakes, because Britain insisted on that, and the Americans continued to object to this. This is why they went to war.
Hey, thank you. And the follow-up question about stealing the tea was also from Jim Holmes. All right, so next question, and this was the third question. Jim had three. What was the immediate fallout or impact to other cities or colonies after the Tea Party, and how did the news spread?
Yeah, I mean, Paul Revere, I think, delivers the news in person, but you know, and then of course the Sons of Liberty make sure to get this out in the newspapers so that more people can read about it. So in Philadelphia, the news arrives just before Christmas, and they put it in a little box in the newspaper that they call a Christmas box. You know, now privately, not every American thought this was a great idea. Some of them were worried, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. And they're like, I don't know, maybe we ought to pay the East India Company back for the tea. Maybe this was going too far, right? And so there is some questioning of this, although there were also people who were like, yeah, the Bostonians did what they had to do. But really, so opinion doesn't really unite until Americans begin hearing about Parliament's response, which was the coercive acts. the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Quebec Act, the Quartering Act, and then of course the Quebec Act kind of adds to their problems. So by 1774, by the summer of 1774, Americans are really ready to send delegates to the Continental Congress, begin telling militia to train, all this other stuff. But the initial reaction to the Boston Tea Party is a little bit mixed, right? Like worrying about what the blowback is going to be. And then, of course, it takes months to find this out because it takes 6 weeks or whatever for the news to get to London, and then and then they've got to decide on their response, and then it's going to take 6 more weeks for the results to arrive back on American shores. So, I mean, we forget that communication wasn't immediate back then, so that that does affect the way the events play out.
Right, thank you. Next question is from Jim Griffith of the Alabama Society. Jim says, I have heard that tea could be considered a drug because of caffeine, but caffeine existed in coffee and chocolate as well. Mm-hmm. So was the growth and popularity of coffee and chocolate similar to the growth of tea? Were the impacts of those products similar to the impact of tea?
The answer is yes and no. I mean, different European countries and their descendants end up having different affinities for these 3 beverages, but really Europeans begin drinking them all at the same time. Now, coffee comes from Mexico. Chocolate comes from Mexico. Coffee initially comes from Ethiopia or Yemen or both, and tea comes exclusively at this time from China. And in all of those kind of native regions for those crops, the people who drank it most commonly tended to drink it straight without sugar. Europeans don't tend to find these beverages as palatable until they begin drinking them with sugar. And really at the start of the 16th century, some of these are used in medicinal ways or only used as kind of elite luxuries. But by the time you get to the 1700s, tea is a widespread beverage. You can find chocolate and coffee in American markets as well, but tea was thought to be the most popular, the most refined, the one that Americans found the most palatable. I mean, Spanish-speaking people drank more chocolate. You could find coffee drinkers in Central Europe, etc. But England and America also had coffee houses. But tea also seems to have captured the imaginations of British and American people in part because the ladies' tea tables, right? There's not as much of an equivalent for that for chocolate drinking or coffee consumption. Coffee houses were merchant houses and places where I think you could get booze as well. But tea was more domestic. Culturally, that's just the way that it turns out. So yeah, Americans enjoyed a number of different caffeinated beverages, all of which had become widespread with the help of sugar, which is also addictive, by the way. But I talk about the kind of these 3 products as triplets that came from different parts of the world and which were in a way a product of European commerce. And so, yeah, which one becomes more popular? It really is tea in 1773. And tea remains the most popular beverage in America, even after the Tea Party. The reason why a lot of Americans switch to coffee is that coffee from Jamaica or Brazil just becomes a lot more widely available and inexpensive as compared to tea, which the British really still had more of a lock on, both in terms of tea from China and then the tea that British colonists begin farming in South Asia as well. So yeah, coffee takes over, but in America, but not really because of the Boston Tea Party.
All right, this brings up something else that I'd like you to talk about a little bit. Coffee houses were where men gathered to read their newspapers, to get information, to share opinions and find out what's going on in the world. Tea and the ladies' tea seemed to be the corresponding venue where the women would get together. So let's talk a little bit about the difference in the 2 and how the ladies embrace tea.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a cultural panic about this, which is really interesting, right? There are people who worry, oh, tea is a superfluous luxury. For women to purchase tea and all the ceramic and silver fine things that go with serving tea is a luxury that women are going to force their husbands to pay for. And then if you had a bunch of women alone at the tea table, they would cook up gossip and scandal. So there were all these reasons why men would wring their hands and worry about tea consumption. But for women, it's this amazing thing, right? It is an opportunity for them to preside both over their fellow women and men as well, right? It was the hostess who really presided. And so it creates this space of cultural power for women. And so women are an important part of my story, because any boycotts of tea were going to need women's cooperation. And so some women very patriotically step forward and say, I refuse to drink tea, I won't serve it in my home, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the interesting things is that you see women staging these little rebellions as well, being like, oh, I'm going to just keep on secretly drinking it in defiance of the boycott, even though my husband is a son of liberty, because I still prefer this beverage and I want to maintain my own independence, right? And so you can kind of see them as daughters of liberty either way, either asserting female independence or standing with men who were sons of liberty on behalf of American independence eventually. So yeah, women are an important part of my story. There's a lot of stories of women aiding the men who participated in the Tea Party, helping them get disguised, helping them change out of their disguises afterwards. Women were often the ones who passed on the stories about a man's participation in the Boston Tea Party. So I paid a lot of attention to women's role in my book. And again, like, you really can't picture the revolution without women's participation.
I got a couple questions here to wrap up the Defiance of the Patriots, and then we'll get to the to your new book. Mm-hmm. One is from Bryce Terry of the International Society, who said he is fascinated with where words come from. What is a nabob, and was being called one a good thing?
Yeah, it was generally not at this time thought to be a good thing. It's initially applied to, in Britain at least, it's initially applied to men who came back from the East Indies having struck it rich. And then a lot of them are able to buy peerages and throw around gobs of money and join parliament. I mean, just fabulously wealthy. And, Britain's a pretty conservative place, right? You were supposed to make money by having inherited it from your great-great-great-grandfather and your lordly estates, right? And earning money from forcing other people to farm your lands, right? That was the good way of making money, to make your money in commerce and then come from nothing and then all of a sudden be fabulously wealthy. That makes you jumped up, an Arab East, a nabob, right? And so their influence was suspicious. They weren't thought to be of as good breeding, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the way the term is generally used. And I apologize, this talk was rescheduled and I had looked it up, but I believe it derives from Hindi, or that's where the term was originally used.
And last question, how has the public perception of the Boston Tea Party changed from 1773 to today?
Oh man, I mean, I have an entire talk about this, and I need to, work it into the Tea Party talks that I'm going to be giving as the anniversary approaches. Because people have interpreted the Boston Tea Party in all sorts of ways. I mean, Alfred Young wrote a great book called The Shoemaker and the Tea Party, where he talks about why all of a sudden it starts being called the Boston Tea Party in the 1820s and then especially in the 1830s. That initially it was just called the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor. And he has two theories about why they start calling it the Boston Tea Party. Either it was a way for the upper class to kind of whitewash the event and say, hey, this wasn't about violent resistance. It was only a tea party, right? It was this kind of peaceful event, et cetera, et cetera. And look how nice it was. And look how non-threatening our memory of the revolution is. Or his other theory is that actually it was a bit of a working class joke, right? Like, oh yes, you have your polite tea parties. You want to see a tea party? This was a tea party, right? We intimidated the consignees and we intimidated the ship captains, and then we boarded these ships and chopped up these crates and destroyed all that tea. And let the elites remember that that when working class people want to get a job done, they get a job done. And so but really we don't have that meaning as much anymore. What we mostly have is the more whitewashed meaning. But if you look throughout American history and even global history, you will see all sorts of people invoking the Boston Tea Party in memory of their cause. people in favor of temperance and people who are against temperance, people who are in favor of abolitionism and people who are against abolitionism, people acting on behalf of Black civil rights and members of the Ku Klux Klan, people who want less taxes on legal marijuana establishments nowadays. People have invoked it for anti-monopoly reasons and for anti-tax reasons. A British newspaper mentions it in relation to Gandhi's protests in South Africa, ripping up registration cards. So it's got all these different meanings, and it endures because it's associated with the origins of the United States. It endures because people see it as this great act of civil disobedience. It endures because it's so vivid and easy to picture. It appeals to young boys because there were young boys who were involved in it. So it's just one of those incidents that superficially is really easy to explain, but just, captures the imagination in all sorts of ways.
All right, thank you. And folks, that I highly recommend the book, and there's no better time to go out there and read it and learn about the defiance of the Patriots and the Boston Tea Party than right now as we get ready for our 250th celebration. All right, next up is Ben's current book, the just recently released, The Great New York Fire. Yep. So it's Great New York Fire of 1776, a lost story of the American Revolution. It is a lost story. It's very little is known about the Great Fire of New York City, or the fact, the impacts, the long-term impacts of the fire. So we're going to get into our questions now. First question up is from Bobby Hulse of the Kansas Society and Jim Griffith of the Alabama Society. They asked similar questions, so we sort of combined it and give them both credit for asking. But I understand that Congress refused George Washington's request to burn the city. So who do you believe set the fire?
Yeah. I talk about this extensively, right? This is that correspondence between Congress and Washington is available to historians as early as the 1780s, 1790s. It's one of the first things that historians can consult. In fact, there are a lot of early histories of the Revolution that mention that correspondence and then don't mention that a fire subsequently happened, right? And it's even used as an example of Washington deferring to civilian authority. And I spend some time in the book kind of parsing the language. But the other thing that I do is I hold it up against another set of Washington's correspondence, one that wasn't available to historians until the 1940s, I think, where he writes to his cousin Lund, who's acting as the caretaker of Mount Vernon. And this is October 6th, after the fire is over. And he says, Congress's refusal to allow New York City to be burned is one of its capital errors. They're going to have cause to regret it, et cetera, et cetera. And then he drops the subject. And then he comes back to it a paragraph later and he says, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, Providence, or some good honest fellow, has done what we weren't going to do for ourselves. In other words, God or some good honest fellow has now burned New York City. And then his only regret was that enough of it remains to answer the British purposes, that strategically the British still, enough of New York City was still intact, that the British were now going to be able to make use of New York City. So Washington clearly thought that the destruction of New York City was a good idea. One of the things that he says in his initial correspondence with Congress is, hey, if you do order me to burn New York City, make sure you keep it a profound secret, because it's going to make a big change in the British Army's plans. But the other reason to keep it a secret is that Washington knew that burning cities would have made him look bad. That's one of the reasons why he's trying to ask Congress for permission, is that he doesn't want the responsibility for burning New York City to all fall on him. And so, again, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I don't want to argue from an absence of evidence. I don't think I have Washington dead to rights. But it certainly is possible that accompanying that letter from Congress saying, no, we've resolved that you shouldn't burn New York City, which they did pass that resolve publicly, that they also had a letter that said, yes, burn New York City if you have to, but also make sure you destroy this letter and keep it a secret. And therefore, there's nothing for historians to consult. It's also possible that that Washington basically said, all right, Congress has told me, and then he said something like, the equivalent of Henry II. Well, no one rid me of this meddlesome city. And then some enterprising junior officer is like, I got you, boss. And then, left some saboteurs behind and or sent some men over from Paulus Hook, New Jersey to row over the Hudson River and do this deed. So again, I don't have Washington dead to rights, but I definitely give the reader all the evidence I can to suggest that Washington really did think this was strategically a good idea, and he may well have had a hand in the destruction of New York City, but that if he had done so, he absolutely would have done his utmost to cover his tracks. Because he didn't want to take responsibility. The other thing that he also didn't want is to be blamed for not having sufficient control over his men, right? And this is another piece of context that I look at, is that the Army of 1776 was a very disobedient one. They're deserting all over the place. They're misbehaving in all sorts of ways. Washington is writing to Congress saying, I need you to update the Articles of War, because right now the upper limit is 39 lashes for various offenses. I need you to up that to 100 or even 200 in order to punish men for various kinds of disobedience. And I need there to be a few more crimes that will be capital crimes that I can hang soldiers for. So Washington is very, very frustrated with his men, particularly the militia. There was widespread criticism of the behavior of the soldiers at the Battle of Kip's Bay on September 15th, which was 6 days before the fire. So, and there was even a suggestion by one officer that the New England soldiers were ready to frag some of the senior officers in the Continental Army if they didn't stop disparaging the behavior of the New England soldiers. So there were a lot of mutual recriminations among officers and soldiers. And it's quite possible that those resentments had built up enough by September 21st that a mixture of radical civilians and disobedient soldiers and field officers might have taken it upon themselves to burn New York City in defiance of what Washington was ostensibly telling them to do. But whether it was ordered by Washington from top down or whether it was bottom up by this mixture of civilians and more junior officers and soldiers, either way, I think it's undeniable that people affiliated with the American cause burned New York City for a combination of military, political, and religious and really emotional reasons.
All right, that's a great insight. Our next question up is from Jim Griffith of the Alabama Society. I understand that many locations in the city were plundered as the Americans withdrew. I'm assuming that all but Tories and British soldiers had evacuated the occupied city. So am I correct in assuming the plundering occurred by British soldiers? If so, is there data that backs this up?
Data, no. I mean, there definitely is evidence, right? Some testimonies, etc. I mean, the British and Hessian soldiers definitely plundered, but the other thing to keep in mind is that New York City was occupied by the American army, most of whom were from out of town. Washington gets there in April, but there were already some troops there before that. All the way through September 15th, New York City was occupied by American soldiers, and there's a lot of evidence that they were plundering loyalist property and making a mess out of things. I mean, that's just what soldiers do. And if you read the memoirs of Joseph Plum Martin, he talks about like stealing booze, from some cellar somewhere. And he's like, we didn't really mean anything by it. We were just, bored and waiting around, et cetera, et cetera. So there was, plundering happened by both armies, really. Of course, you read a lot about it in American newspapers as being something that the British and Hessians had done. But as far as who was in the city, I mean, throughout 1776, people are evacuating. They know that a battle is going to happen in New York City, and they want to get their families out of harm's way. Very often, a wealthy family would move away and leave a servant or enslaved person behind to kind of look over things. Whether you were a loyalist, some loyalists escaped to British ships in the harbor because there were British warships around New York throughout 1776. Some of them flee there. Some of them try and shack up with relatives outside of the city. And Americans, sympathizers also, Patriot sympathizers also evacuated the city. Everybody wants to be out of the way of this thing. Now, after the Americans leave, some loyalists begin filtering back, but there's only 6 days between the Battle of Kips Bay and the burning of New York City. So probably not too many civilians had returned yet. I mean, they're really, New York City was at its pre-war population at its height was probably about 25,000 people. There may have been as few as 3,000 to 5,000 civilians left in Manhattan around this time of September of 1776. I mean, it really was an American garrison and then a British garrison. And of course, there's some auxiliary support from within those armies and from the local civilian population, but a lot of civilians just weren't there anymore, and have to hear about this stuff from afar.
All right. Next up, a question from Shane James, the International Society. Of the various personalities you discovered during your research on the Great New York Fire, who was the most interesting or surprising?
It's hard to pick a favorite. Surprising. Well, the most surprising, right, is this idea of maybe to a lot of people is the idea that one of the people who supposedly burned, at least one of the people who supposedly burned New York, is a woman, and we don't know her name, but she's talked about in British newspapers, and then Edmund Burke mentions her on the floor of Parliament, and there's a French a history book about the revolution that has like a beautiful image of women carrying torches and burning New York and being confronted by British soldiers. So that's in a way the most surprising, but the most interesting singular character for whom we have a name. It's a toss-up between Abraham Van Dyke, who I've also written about elsewhere, and a guy named a spy named Abraham Patton, who I think deserves to be more famous than Nathan Hale. Abraham Patton probably was born in Pennsylvania. His dad moved the family to the Waxhaws, where Andrew Jackson grew up on the North Carolina-South Carolina border. And he spent some time there. He signs a petition there, maybe. Then he moves back to Pennsylvania. He's a wheelwright, and he owns a farmstead in Salisbury Township, Pennsylvania. He gets married in the Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. And then he and his wife moved to Baltimore. At least 3 out of his 4 children are born in Baltimore. He's shown pursuing runaway indentured servants. He sells an enslaved person. And then he apparently is a captain in the American Army, at least according to newspaper, like post office announcements. Like, there's a letter left for you, Captain Abraham Patton. But I can't find him anywhere in military records from either Pennsylvania or from Maryland. And I really tried my best, and I can't find him in military records. To skip ahead a little bit, he spends much of late 1776 and 1777 traveling back and forth between British-occupied New York City and New Jersey, reporting on British troop movements. And he's mentioned in the Washington correspondence in a couple of different places. He was definitely acting as a spy. And then in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which was occupied by the British in June of 1777, he's arrested for trying to bribe a British grenadier. And he was supposedly part of a plot to set the magazines on fire in New Brunswick in coordination with an American attack. And this was supposed to happen on King George III's birthday. But instead he's caught and he goes to the gallows, and the British and Hessian officers who observe him say, man, this guy really, went to the gallows in this very noble and brave way. He pulled the hood down over his face himself. He gave a line from Addison's Cato, which same as Nathan Hale, right? Talking about the self-sacrifice, the patriotic sacrifice that he was making. And then on the gallows, he supposedly also confessed to being one of the men who set New York City on fire, but refused to name his accomplices. And this then comes out in a loyalist New York City newspaper. And then the really interesting thing, the kicker to me, is that Washington then writes about this to Hancock and say, yeah, we really ought to compensate this guy's family, because the newspaper mentioned his widow and children. We really ought to compensate this guy's family, but let's do it in a private way, given the line of work that he was in. So here, this isn't one of those other things that makes me think maybe Washington knew more about the burning of New York City than he lets on, because he vouches for Abraham Patton and for some other captains who were involved in burning New York City or White Plains, New York. He vouches for them in one way or another, and what's behind that? So Abraham Patton, to me, this spy, who dies in New Jersey but is associated with the Carolinas and Pennsylvania, and spent time in New York and may have been part of the army when it was in Massachusetts as well. Here's a guy who had traveled widely. I describe him as rootless, reckless, and ruthless. and may have been responsible for something way more consequential than Nathan Hale, who of course is hanged the day after the New York City fire, but probably didn't have anything to do with it. And hey, Nathan Hale had fancier college friends that brag about his noble deeds for decades afterwards. Patton doesn't seem to have the same posthumous fan club, and he really deserves, especially for fans of American espionage, he maybe deserves to have a bit more recognition for what he had done during the war.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great insight, and a pretty significant guy. You're right; he's not well known at all.
Yeah, for people who know John Nagy's work, he does mention some things about Patton, but he doesn't appear very often in the records.
Well, a lot of folks might not realize that. I mean, one of the reasons George Washington wanted to burn New York City was to deny its use to the British. The port of New York is probably one of the better harbors, larger. Charles Lee and others identified that if you control the water, you control the city. And the British, being a naval power, wanted New York City so they would have a headquarters in the colonies. And in fact, they settled in there and never left. Didn't even leave until sometime after the peace treaty had been signed, before General Clinton and, well, not Clinton himself, but his follow-on, had left. So New York, if it had been burned, if it had been razed to the ground, might the British have gone somewhere else? And if they had gone somewhere else, how might that have affected the Revolutionary War? Now, I'm not asking that.
Such a big question, my goodness.
Yeah, that's a bigger area of discussion, and that could probably be a whole nother session.
Yeah. I could try and give a brief answer to it anyway. I mean, Washington has three choices in 1776. He knows he can't defend New York City, not with the British Navy, and the British Army already on Staten Island, and then after the Battle of Brooklyn, Western Long Island as well, right? Like, he's getting hemmed in. The British start taking other little islands around Manhattan. He knows his days are numbered. And so his only question is, and this is what he writes to Congress about, right? Should I leave the city intact, or should I burn it behind me? Right. And I mean, he knows all the advantages that the British will have from New York City. It'll be a winter headquarters. It'll be a naval base, right? They'll be able to use, the Navy will be able to use the shipyards. And also it'll be a central, it's a strategic position for the Hudson River, for New Jersey, Connecticut, Long Island, right? So that's all important. And also it would then become a marketplace for American civilians. Right? Maybe not just loyalists, but also people who were maybe on the fence. All right, I've got farm produce. The British have opened New York back up for business. I'm going to take my produce from Westchester County or whatever, and and set it up in New York. That New York would then become a beacon for the reestablishment of American loyalty to the crown. These are all the things that Washington and Congress fear about the British occupation of New York. Now, it doesn't really work out that way for the British. And the truth is, although New York Harbor is reputed to be, it's such an important harbor, et cetera, a lot of British Navy men hated New York Harbor and found it really difficult to navigate. And there was a strong suggestion that, look, it may not be as strategic, but Newport or Halifax are a way better place for the British Navy, right? And that it's the British personnel the insistence on keeping British personnel in New York actually undermines the British war effort in a lot of ways. They have to keep troops there. Maybe they should have turned to the South earlier. They don't use it effectively to coordinate with Burgoyne's failed campaign, or maybe the campaign to try and take and hold the Hudson Champlain corridor was doomed to failure at the outset anyway. And Washington too is kind of obsessed with New York, all the way up to right before the Battle of Yorktown. He's like, when can we take back New York? I mean, both armies are really focused on New York City in a way that it may not have been as effective a strategic position as either of the commanders-in-chief, any of the commanders-in-chief on either side really thought. So it's a really interesting problem. But one of the first things I say in the book is that New York was at the center of the war in 1776. And I was presenting this in California, and a scholar who was from Philadelphia, he said, "What do you mean New York is at the center of 1776? It's Philadelphia." But but if you look at the war, right, everybody is focused on New York. I mean, the British send this enormous amphibious expedition of something like 40,000 people to try and take New York, and so they do so successfully because it's just impossible for Washington to defend all of these islands and New Jersey and Westchester all at once. He's just, it's an impossible task. And then, yeah, the British park themselves there, but they don't ultimately win the war as a result of that. And the date of the British evacuation, by the way, is November 25th, 1783. And New Yorkers used to celebrate Evacuation Day. Bostonians, of course, still celebrate Evacuation Day, but the reason they, it coincides, as it happens, with St. Patrick's Day, and Boston ended up having a significant Irish population. So they still celebrate Evacuation Day in Boston on March 17th, but we don't celebrate Evacuation Day in New York on November 25th, in part because, well, it's been taken over by the Thanksgiving festivities, and parades and Santa Claus, bring people together a lot more than thinking about the departure of the British, particularly because our alliances with the British in the 20th century have been so important for the United States geopolitically.
It's fascinating to think what would have happened if New York had been burned, and if the British had moved maybe to Charleston, maybe to Norfolk, maybe to a different location, how things might have played out.
I didn't even think about that in the book, but you're right. Like, what if the fire had actually been as successful as the conspirators wanted, right? What would the British have done? Maybe they would have still held the position, but but for all their civilian auxiliaries and stuff, they would have had to choose somewhere else. I mean, they do take Newport later that year. Maybe Newport would have been the principal headquarters.
Could have been. All right, another question from Jim Griffith here. Are there any remaining marks in New York City from the fire of 1776?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, pre-revolutionary things in New York City are the fence around Bowling Green, the Morris Jumel Mansion, and St. Paul's Cathedral, which was a survivor of the fire. And it's interesting to think of St. Paul's as sort of survivor of the fire because it also became a place of refuge in the aftermath of 9/11 for for various workers who were involved in that. And so the fire is mentioned, I believe, in a plaque outside Trinity Church. Of course, the current Trinity Church at the corner of Wall Street and Broadway is the third church, right? The first one is burned during the fire of New York City, and I recently looked at this, and I believe there's a plaque mentioning it. But as far as physical evidence of the fire, I mean, if you go down there now, the 18th century landscape is unrecognizable. I mean, it's the financial district. You have these giant skyscrapers. You can't even see the landscape because of the tall buildings blocking it. And also there's been, new construction on landfill in that area. The World Trade Center is built on landfill, right? Everything from Greenwich Street west, right, is land that didn't exist in 1776. So it's very difficult to reimagine the 18th century landscape. But you can overlay the map, the maps of the extent of the fire damage with modern day New York and kind of see it. So people ask me, oh, what's the extent? And I say, well, it's from Whitehall Slip, where the Staten Island ferry leaves. The fire kind of goes north of there, curls around Bowling Green, jumps over Broadway, and then burns almost everything from Broadway to the coastline, almost everything except for some fancy mansions, all the way up to what's now Park Place, or halfway up City Hall Park. And that left out most of the commercial and shipbuilding district, by the way. Most of the commercial and shipbuilding district survives the fire of 1776 just fine.
Well, that rolls right into Jim's next question, which you just addressed, which was, how did the fire fundamentally change New York? And were the structures built back, or were there major changes as a result of the fire? So
yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question. I always get asked this, and it makes me wish that I had spent a bit more time on it in the book. I mean, the area becomes known as Canvas Town because you have these brick husks with canvas sails stretched over as roofs. It becomes a bit of a down and out place for refugees, for the unhomed, for enslaved people who had escaped from their masters. It's really down and out, and it remains so for at least a few years after the British occupation was done. One interesting thing is you have New Yorkers throughout the 19th century kind of lamenting, gosh, like we've got this new grid, that we're laying out for Manhattan. Maybe it's a bit of a shame that more of the city didn't burn, because then we could have built over that tangled grid of Lower Manhattan with a more rational gridded plan for that area too. So you see this, and there's like a kind of desire to really erase everything about the fire, and it has successfully been erased. But yeah, during the war, the British do not get around to making any repairs. Trinity Church does build a new Trinity Church there. They actually owned a lot of the land that was burned, a lot of working class housing behind Trinity Church and St. Paul's Cathedral, working class, mostly wooden housing. So the Church of England is still a major landowner in that part of the city, actually. And eventually they redevelop it.
Talk a little bit about the Holy Ground.
Yeah. So the area behind St. Paul's Church gets a reputation during the American occupation of New York City as being a red light district, a place to find sex workers. And so the ironic name of Holy Ground, because it's Church of England land, is applied. And of course, if you're a New England Congregationalist, right, you're doubly offended by this. Look at these, the Church of England, they own, the land on which all these houses of prostitution appear. There are a lot of hand-wringing New England officers who are like, look at how it's corrupting my soldiers. There are fights between sex workers and soldiers. It's not really very good for discipline, et cetera, et cetera. And so Phil Mead, who now works at the Museum of the American Revolution, he wrote a great dissertation in which he kind of says that maybe some of the unease about the Holy Ground made it a target during the fire. And so he used some of my earlier research about the fire being deliberate, and read all these great officers' diaries and correspondences about the Holy Ground. And he draws this conclusion. And so one suggestion is that maybe the woman who was found behind St. Paul's burning New York City, maybe she was a sex worker. And there's no way to know with the information that we have now, but the intersection between calling that area the Holy Ground and then a lot of that area being the part that was destroyed during the fire, it's at least suggestive. It's something worth thinking about.
All right, very good. I'm going to wrap up here with our last question, and it gets back to the root of your book. Why is the Great Fire of New York, the Great New York Fire of 1776, so little known and considered a lost story? That's from
Oh gosh, I have such a long answer to this. I mean, the British launch investigations of the fire in 1776 and 1783. If they'd been able to make a bigger deal and convict people at some kind of at courts martial or something like that, and then made a more effective propaganda campaign out of it, maybe they would have forced us to reckon with the memory of the fire. But for a variety of reasons, both of those investigations fail. And meanwhile, the Americans swing into action immediately. I mean, there are all sorts of soldiers and officers' correspondence immediately after the fire that say, oh yeah, I guess our guys finally burned New York City, just like they said they were going to do all summer. But then immediately, Washington's camp and Congress swing into action to be like, no, it was an accident. We have no idea how this happened. And by the way, look at all the British and Hessian plundering. They're killing women and children. They're slitting people's throats. They arbitrarily threw a bunch of people into the fire. Some of that's true, some of that's not, but it's this immediate disinformation campaign that makes it into American newspapers, of Americans saying how ridiculous and offensive for you to suggest that the Americans burned New York City. Instead, look at the towns that the British have already burned and how awful the British have behaved during the 1776 campaign. And so the story is buried. And so if you read biographies of George Washington, histories of the American Revolution, or histories of New York City that were written throughout the 19th century, almost none of them suggest that the fire was set deliberately. At most, they will suggest, oh, maybe it was some miscreants that do that. Chief Justice John Marshall writes that in his biography of Washington, that, that it was just, no political significance to this. It had nothing to do with the America's political and military aims, et cetera, et cetera. And so by the time modern historians get around to looking at this in the late 20th century, they have very little to go on. I mean, every generation, there's some person who says, you know what, maybe this was just a classic scorched earth tactic, and why are we still trying to cover this up? Or, don't we imagine that Congress would have denied this, even if they had done it deliberately? So you can find in 1822 or in the 1870s, or, or William Henry Shelton, who was the curator of the Morris Jumel mansion. You can find people suggesting like, oh yeah, I do kind of think the Americans did it, but they are these kind of lone minority voices. And the mainstream histories, for the most part, say, no way the Americans did it. Or modern historians now are like, we don't know. There's a lot of evidence in different directions. We're going to throw up our hands and sort of avoid this. We can't really prove it. And so we're not going to try and make this claim. So my book is really the first book to kind of to treat the fire in the fullest possible capacity. And what I conclude, looking at all the evidence that I've looked at, is that it was definitely a deliberate act by the Americans, and that the preponderance of evidence suggests that that is a truer story than the idea that it might have been a complete accident.
All right. Well, Ben, thank you so very much for joining us for this session of Speaking Out About History. And
the questions were wonderful. It was really a pleasure.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and we certainly enjoyed having you. The two books, guys, you're gonna enjoy them. You really need to go out and take a look at these. And very well written, very entertaining, well illustrated.
Yeah, 30 images in each.
All right. So thank you so much.
Thank you.